Welcome, everyone, to the weekly Sunday service of the North Texas Church of Freethought. It is Sunday, the 14th of November, 2021. Please visit our website, as you see at the top there, and our Facebook page on the lower. You can subscribe on our website to our weekly notices of what we're doing. The bottom of every page has got a place you just put in your email address, and that way you get the notices of what we're doing, anything of interest that you could attend, and also reminders of this weekly either Zoom or in-person meeting, which the in-person meetings we have on the first Sunday of the month for those of us who are vaccinated, all the sensible people, which we all are. So if you're watching this later on YouTube, please subscribe and hit that like button, add your comments below, and go to our website to sign up and get that information. And for goodness sakes, do get vaccinated, as I said, against the COVID-19 and flu as well, if you're not already. The argument from design is certainly the most widely known proof for the existence of God. Of course, we cannot really ever prove anything except in mathematics, and then at the cost of assuming the truth of various axioms, so that whatever is proved is really already contained in those axioms. In addition, there is no agreed upon definition of or even a description of God. God is different things to different people, even within a single religious tradition. And add to that the fact that Mickey Mouse exists in some sense, but what Godists have in mind is an existence not in the imagination or works of fiction or money-making theme parks, but existence in the same sense as the sun and the moon exist in objective reality. Basically, Godists insist that there's no better explanation for everything that exists, or even that anything exists, but their deity. There are many variations, of course, many. I don't even know if anybody's ever counted them all up, but they all come to the same thing, which is the claim that when it comes to problems for which we have as yet no satisfactory solutions, God is the best, if not the only answer. God, in other words, is the explanation for whatever we are ignorant about. It might as well be said that God is our ignorance. Our ancestors, of course, are ignorant of an awful lot of things: the weather, volcanoes, illnesses, dreams, and even unexpected and often unwelcome emotions. If you read the Odyssey, Homer's Odyssey, you'll find passages where they talk about this or that God went down and gave somebody an emotion to make them act a certain way. So it's not surprising that for our ancestors, gods accounted for and explained all these things. Nowadays, we know better. Well, some of us know better.
Papa Bear Bill O'Reilly has taken some hits recently over a philosophical breakthrough I reported on this month. Jim? This week, Bill did what centuries of philosophers before him could not do. He proved the existence of God.
Tide goes in, tide goes out. Never a miscommunication. I say, listen, sun goes up, sun goes down, tide comes in, tide comes out. There's no miscommunication. Yeah. Sun comes up, the sun goes down. The tide comes in, the tide goes out. It always happens. Never a miscommunication.
But somehow there are still atheists. Worse yet, folks, the lefty blogosphere has ridiculed Bill by pointing out that the moon causes the tides and that we've known that for centuries. Well, it's humble pie time, people who took 9th grade science. Father O'Reilly, take him to Sunday school.
How'd the moon get there? Look, you pinheads who attacked me for this, you guys are just desperate. How'd the moon get there? How'd the sun get there? How'd it get there? Can you explain it to me? How come we have that and Mars doesn't have it? You understand? Why not? How'd it get here?
Boom! Take that, gravity huggers! Huh? How come we have the moon and Mars doesn't? Except for the two that it has. How'd the sun get there? Where does it go at night? How'd the moon get there? Why does the cow jump over it? What time is it? How come I have two faucets? Hot comes out of one, cold comes out of the other. Never a miscommunication. You can't explain that. You can't explain that. In fact, where does Bill O'Reilly come from? He's on my TV, he's off my TV, then he's back. Where'd he come from? Sometimes he's on the radio, and I'm watching him on the TiVo at the same time. You can't explain that. Why does my TiVo think I want to record swamp walkers? Nobody knows. Nobody knows. Can't explain that. Okay? You're desperate. And as long as nobody knows, the answer has got to be God. QED, PDQ. Look, all Bill is saying is that God is the answer to everything. And where does God come from? That's easy. Oh, God. That can't be answered with God. I mean, how could he make himself if he wasn't there yet to make him? Therefore, there is no God, and everything is just a chaotic collection of random energy with no meaning. I love you, Bill O'Reilly. No, 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 no. No, no. No, Jimmy, quick. Jimmy, quick.
The tide comes in, the tide goes out. It always happens. Never a miscommunication.
Thank you, Bill, for giving my life meaning. You're like St. Thomas Aquinas, in that your understanding of the world is also from the 13th century.
Well, regardless of what you think of Stephen Colbert, he does pretty well when he has something like this to work with. He could easily have gone on, as there is much more to it, as we'll get to in a minute. There's so much more, though, that we can't really possibly cover it all. Not today, perhaps not in a lifetime, if all of the odds and ends are followed out. But we can, though, make a brief survey. And I put this slide up because I want to make sure people understand we don't want to ridicule anybody. We're doing this because there's no reasonable hope of validating Godism, but because figuring out how things go wrong is how we learn to get them right. Certainly in medicine, in engineering, in economics, in society and politics generally, and in our own personal lives in particular, this is true. In studying and making sense of diseases, failures, recessions and depressions, wars, pandemics, corruption and collapse, and even our personal disappointments and disputes, we learn extremely valuable lessons, or we should, because they're there. We learn how to do better. Indeed, we almost certainly learn more and better from our painful mistakes than we do from our lucky successes, however much more we may enjoy the latter than the former. Best of all, to learn from the mistakes of others. As the wise person said, no one lives long enough to make all the mistakes yourself. So the argument from design is worth the attention even of, perhaps especially of, atheists, because it goes to some of the central issues of how we humans make sense of things. It involves the psychology of belief, of what the human mind is prepared to accept as explanation, of how and why we decide to leave off asking questions that go beyond what we suppose we understand, and even maybe the limits of what we may be capable of understanding. As the term implies, the classic watchmaker analogy calls attention to design. And so successful have Godists been in getting it accepted that design implies a designer, that to be clear, it is necessary to attach some adjective. We might say there is apparent or seeming design, for example. Notice the subtitle of Dawkins' book, A Universe Without Design. Well, that's not quite right, is it? What would make the best sense would be the addition of the word intentional, a universe without intentional design. Of course, the fact is a design may be the product of a designer, but design simply means a pattern, a form, a structure, a shape, an arrangement. None of these require a pattern maker, a former, a structurer, a shaper, or an arranger, or at any rate, not a purposeful, intelligent, or personal one. It is a fact that there are regularities in the world of objective reality that we share. It is these that science seeks to study and understand, though our scientific understanding comes down to, if you think about it, little more than description. As we saw with O'Reilly doubling down on his foolishness with, well, so then where did the moon come from? We can always ask another why. It is exactly this that Godists want to shut down with their God backstop as what they call their final cause. Fascinatingly, they don't even realize what they're doing when they say, for example, that the exact values of a handful of fundamental constants of physics are what they are because God chose to make them that way. That's their fine-tuning argument. Because if an omnipotent deity intentionally chose the value of, say, the fine structure constant, this is a dimensionless constant which quantifies the strength of electromagnetic forces to be what it is so that the universe could support life as we know it, then why did their deity have to choose this exact value? Asked another way, why couldn't an omnipotent deity choose whatever value it liked for the fine structure constant? They could just make it work. They didn't have to pick that one. But apparently there are rules for making universes capable of sustaining life. Where did those rules come from? From God? So God could have just made different rules, right? Yes, the humor is more subtle than Colbert's. I can't really compete with that guy. So what about design? Up until the 19th century, late in the 19th century, and even into the early 20th, there was great emphasis on the many effective ways, especially the very complex ways that living things managed to survive and ensure their reproduction. Things like the bucket orchid there at the top left, hummingbirds and hornbills were pointed to as evidence of divine providence. More troublingly, there were other instances in nature where needless suffering and cruelty are essential elements. That's that bottom right picture of the ichneumon wasp. As Darwin put it in 1860, that was a year after the publication of his Origin of Species, in a letter to American naturalist Asa Gray, I cannot persuade myself that a beneficent and omnipotent God would have designedly created the Ichneumonidae with the express intention of their feeding within the living bodies of caterpillars, or that a cat should play with mice. In other words, built-in cruelty, built-in suffering, pain. Why is that necessary? There's that ichneumon wasp. Again, it's a family of wasps. It's not just one species. And there's a poor caterpillar infested with the pupae of the wasp, eating that is going to eat it alive. Oh, right. Back up. Go. A few more comments about that. The Ichneumonidae, I said, is a family of parasitic wasps. And for some reason, there is little concern these days with the pain and suffering and cruelty that are so widespread in nature. Even if you say, well, humans are bad because they got original sin and so forth, why is all their pain and suffering and cruelty going on in nature? Those who claim that their deity carefully and deliberately created all living things should especially be troubled by that. Of course, we know that most scientists, especially in the life scientists, are atheists, so they accept the reality of natural processes being morally indifferent. Meanwhile, the anti-evolution creationists and intelligent designists never call attention to how, if there is intentional design in nature, obviously it is clearly, stupidly, and even malevolently executed. They are clearly no more troubled by it than they are of the notions of infinite torture as just punishment for finite sin. Okay, so they still point, though, to things like the flagellum. This is a slender, whip-like appendage of some microorganisms that afford them movement. Point to that as an instance of what they call irreducible complexity, which is to say things that cannot possibly, conceivably, ever be explained without their God. Never mind that there are now viable proposals for how things like the flagellum could have come about by natural selection. Even Darwin was puzzled and said this in his writings as to how something like the human eye could have come about by natural selection. All those complex parts, they just had to spring into existence, but no. Here too, it is not difficult to see how an eye could have gradually evolved, beginning with just a patch of light-sensitive cells, and then as you see, step 2, they form a little depression, because if you have light-sensitive cells that are no longer flat, they're kind of depressed, you're going to be able to tell directionality. If the light's shining from one direction, more of them will be illuminated on that side, and so forth. So there are some interesting things that you can go and learn more about, and we're not going to be able to deal with all the creationist business. There's a great place I often refer people to, Talk Origins. I think it's .net, but it's just a load of things having to do with creationism and why it's wrong. And again, very instructive as to why it's wrong, what mistakes they've made. It really kind of sharpens your understanding. It would be great for this kind of stuff to be taught in schools, as long as they also teach why it's wrong. Another important strand in the argument from design is this idea that a supernatural explanation must be accepted because, and whenever, no one can think of a satisfactory natural explanation. As Bill O'Reilly puts it, you can't explain that. Well, as said, a supernatural explanation is no explanation. Indeed, a far-fetched and untestable natural explanation is no explanation either. Something inexplicable happens? Well, maybe invisible extraterrestrials did it. Or maybe time travelers from the future did it. No, a far better way of dealing with a problem that has no clear solution, that really puzzles us, and when none of the possible solutions are very good, is simply to not answer it. Leave the question open. Keep it in mind for further consideration. That is the really interesting thing about science. It doesn't have all the answers. If it did, it would be boring. Or concluding that a problem is solved when we haven't solved it is not a good thing. It's like jailing someone for a crime they did not commit. Just lock them up and, okay, we got that one done, but that's an error and an injustice everywhere, not just when it comes to convicting people of crimes. But when you conclude that a problem is solved and when it hasn't, it allows the real solution to go unrecognized. What if the idea that microorganisms cause disease had been met with inflexible and determined dismissals because, quote, we already know what causes disease, it's divine punishment for our sins? Oh, well, actually, the germ theory of disease was so dismissed for hundreds of years before people like Louis Pasteur, Ignaz Semmelweis. Thought I had their pictures up there too, but Louis Pasteur, Ignaz Semmelweis, John Snow, and Robert Koch, and others, they came along in the 19th century and put the germ theory of disease on a solid foundation. But although these people deserve credit for their work, it might be more accurately said that they owe their accomplishments to the crumbling of the iron-handed rule of the religious political authorities of the Middle Ages, because the idea of the germ theory of disease can be traced back easily to the 11th century. But, of course, it has to be admitted the germ theory of disease is just a theory. Science continues today in setting the example that well-established explanations earn that distinction. It's not because there's any kind of cabal or kind of scheme to enforce some conformity. And this is because there are ways to check out ideas as to whether they're right or wrong, ways to test for the shortcomings and flaws of theories. And yet, the ones that resist such efforts, as I said, thereby earn a reputation as being well-established. Importantly, where well-established explanations are concerned, when flaws are found, they almost always turn into new, exciting discoveries. Einstein showed how and why Newton was wrong, for example. And the discovery of transmissible diseases caused by something too small to be microorganisms didn't dethrone the germ theory of disease, but it did lead to the discovery of prion diseases like bovine or so-called mad cow, spongiform encephalopathy, Kuru, scrapie, and Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. That's the picture on the bottom, because prion diseases cause misfolding of proteins. They're abnormally folded proteins that cause other normally folded proteins to become abnormally folded as well. So those are some more interesting things to read about. If you haven't ever heard of Kuru, K-U-R-U, or scrapie, S-C-R-A-P-I-E, need to go check that out sometime when you've got time to burn. But when it comes to supernaturalism, since there is no way to put such explanations to the test, they persist by sheer inertia. Like Bill says, you can't explain that. Homeopathy, therapeutic touch, acupuncture, and other ideas and practices based on subtle energies unknown and unknowable by objective means, those ideas will never die because, like deities, no facts and no reasons will ever definitively falsify them. As with religious supernaturalism, some ad hoc explanation, God's mysterious ways in the last analysis, can patch over all difficulties. But humanity has come to the point where that is simply not acceptable anymore. Now remember, O'Reilly's never a miscommunication business. He says that and emphasizes it over and over. Did you notice that? Why does he do that? Because if the regularities of nature prove God, then how can miracles, supposed violations of those regularities, also prove God? And then, of course, also claim that the regularities of nature are themselves miracles. This is another clue to the fact that the argument from design or any similar doctrine that is proved by literally anything and everything, is seriously defective. How can anything be said to be understood when there are no problems, no puzzles, no questions, or any difficulties to be made sense of because the doctrine explains everything? This was the situation in pre-modern times when various groups of people held different and usually mutually contradictory beliefs that explained everything as far as they were concerned. But there was absolutely no way to decide which beliefs were in fact correct and which were wrong. So people resorted to violence. And guess what? They still do. In fact, whenever people resort to violence, we should be suspicious that a dogmatic ideology, one or more than one, is involved. Whether it is political, religious, ethnic, or even personal, as in, I think we're all aware of the fact that there are people that go around with a personal opinion, conviction that they're entitled to take your property because they're special in some way, just special. His 1957 book, Conjectures and Refutations, very readable book, by the way. Go ahead and get a copy of that sometime. Austrian-British philosopher Karl Popper talked about this. Excerpt from that book. Those of my friends who were admirers of Marx, Freud, and Adler were impressed by a number of points common to these theories, and especially by their apparent explanatory power. These theories appeared to be able to explain practically everything that happened within the fields to which they referred. Study of any of them seemed to have the effect of an intellectual conversion or revelation. Once your eyes were thus opened, you saw confirming instances everywhere. Whatever happened always confirmed it. Unbelievers were just clearly people who did not want to see the manifest truth, who refused to see it, either because it was against their class interest or because of their repressions. Irrefutability is not a virtue of a theory, as people often think, but a vice. Now, as you consider this, think of the Godists who know they know with certainty that unbelievers refuse to believe and hate God because unbelievers want to sin. These believers atheists, believers say that the atheists delight in evil and reject God, and so God has given unbelievers over to Satan, who owns them and controls them. The experience of such believers is that everything proves the manifest truth of this. It would be hilarious if it wasn't so sad and really scary. But in his earlier Logic of Scientific Discovery of 1935, Popper had already pointed this out. Insofar as a scientific statement speaks about reality, it must be falsifiable. It has to be something that can be doubted and may be disproved. And insofar as it is not falsifiable, it does not speak about reality. Same thing we saw Michael Shermer said earlier. When literally anything and everything proves the truth of some explanation, how can it really be said that anything is explained? That's not explanation. It's dogma. Godists typically expect that the argument from design and their insistence that God is uncreated, eternal, and final cause or first cause and so forth, they just expect that that's going to put a stop to all troublesome questions. For them, it seems all questions are troublesome. They don't like those questions. They want final, certain answers. So just stop thinking and believe. Freethinkers disagree. We enjoy questions. If God was a good explanation for anything, we would ask and expect to have some way of resorting to evidence. How an immaterial being could create material things? Say God spoke it into existence is nonsense. Why didn't God make the universe out of the same immaterial material of which he is composed if he wanted to make things in his own likeness and image? He seems to have done that with angels and demons. Also, even with a watch, it is possible to examine its parts and determine how they were manufactured and assembled. We freethinkers enjoy asking questions that actually have some connection to objective or even subjective experience. But if it's not connected to experience, what hope do we have of getting answers that are actually answers, of getting some sense of what, or even getting what sense of what the answers might be? And we enjoy new ways of thinking about questions that we may have previously considered. Keep in mind that the argument from design is also known as the teleological argument, from the Greek word telos, meaning aim, goal, or purpose. The teleological, putting the emphasis on the fact that God created the universe, but he did so with a purpose in mind. But how could a perfect deity, an omnipotent and immutable, remember, he never changes, just the same eternally, how could such a deity have a purpose? We are expected to believe that this God floated around in his immateriality for an eternity and then one day decided to become a watchmaker. Why? What need suddenly developed in this self-sufficient, perfect being, and how did that come about? In addition, there's the quote from William Paley, the Archdeacon of Carlisle, back in, I think it was 1802 when he wrote his book. And there below, think about what we know about watches. Paley said that a watch requires a watchmaker, but what else would be reasonable to conclude? For watchmakers do not make one watch. They learn their trade and then they make many watches, probably selling most of them to obtain other things in the familiar economic system of division of labor. Now, granted, even that a perfect superhuman being might make a perfect watch on his first try, would he have stopped at one? And what would he do with the surplus watches if not, like the watchmaker, trade them for other things? If we accept the teleological argument then, that the universe is akin to a watch, why should we not also conclude that the universe was made not for the sake of the parts of which it is composed, but for some other purpose, most likely to be sold at a profit? We also know manufactured objects like watches, even if they are perfectly made, can be made of cheap materials to save on cost, and may even be made in such a way as to wear out so that those who use them have to keep buying replacements. Also, watches, even when they do not wear out, can become supplanted by other means of accomplishing the purpose of a watch. At top, if you can see it, that's the kind of watch they had back in Paley's day. Bottom, we see modern watches. But really, how many of us now are even wearing watches? I don't wear a watch. If you are wearing a watch, is it based on designs and limited to functions that people commonly used and were familiar to those people in 1802? Oh, we could go on, couldn't we? And we haven't even brought up yet the fact that, and I wish Colbert would go on because he'd do it in a more funny way than I can. But we haven't even brought up yet the fact that there are a lot of problems, a lot of hazards, and needless pain and suffering in the universe that have nothing to do with the old free will defense. I did mention that earlier, but if the universe is akin to a watch, what does that say about the supposed watchmaker? Perhaps the biggest and most effective refutation of the argument from design is simply all the understanding, not to mention technological innovations and achievements that have followed from excluding supernatural forces and entities from our efforts to make sense of the world. When the French scientist Laplace developed his nebular theory of the formation of the solar system and explained it to people, he responded to a query as to where God fits in. He said, quote, "I have no need of that hypothesis," unquote. And in saying that, he not only spoke the truth, but expressed a fundamental element of scientific inquiry. The old saying that truth will get you farther than lies is itself a truth. And saying we know something that we don't know, regardless of how much faith we may have, is a lie. Let me close with what the late American Nobel Prize-winning physicist Richard Feynman once said. This is from his 1981 book. It was actually a compilation, I think, of interviews. This book, The Pleasure of Finding Things Out. What a great term. Certainly is something that applies to freethinkers. He said, "I can live with doubt and uncertainty and not knowing. I think it's much more interesting to live not knowing than to have answers which might be wrong. I have approximate answers and possible beliefs and different degrees of certainty about different things, but I'm not absolutely sure of anything. There are many things I don't know anything about, such as whether it means anything to ask, why are we here? I might think about it a little bit, and if I can't figure it out, then I go on to something else. But I don't have to know an answer. I don't feel frightened by not knowing things, by being lost in the mysterious universe without having any purpose." And of course, he's talking about any purpose of somebody else. He obviously had a purpose for his own life. And he said, "That's the way it really is as far as I can tell, possibly. It doesn't frighten me." Well, we freethinkers do not have Holy Scripture, but that is a nugget that expresses and reflects what many of us deeply feel and believe. I know some of you appreciate hearing about this day in history. Be seeing other people later in the day, and you can spout this stuff off, and they'll wonder how you got so smart. In 1680, the German astronomer Gottfried Kirch discovers the Great Comet of 1860. That was the first comet discovered with the aid of the telescope. In 1940, Nazi soldiers, aided by locals in what was then Poland, now Belarus, massacred 9,000 residents of the Jewish ghetto in Slonim. In 1967, the first patent was issued to American physicist Theodore Myman for the first laser that he had invented, widely considered the inventor of the laser. In 1969, Apollo 12, the second manned moon landing mission, was launched. I think that was less than 4 months after Apollo 11's success. In fact, Apollo 12 would have been the first moon landing had Apollo 11 failed. We were ready with the backup. That rocket, at the time of launch, was twice struck by lightning as it ascended, but with no damage. I believe they had to switch to auxiliary power in order to get something to work that was a problem. And on this date in 1971, Mariner 9 arrived at Mars. That was the first spacecraft to orbit another planet. It beat Russian probes also headed there by a few weeks. So you can unmute yourselves if you have some comments and or questions, and we'll include this part in what we'll post on YouTube, and then I've got a few more comments before we conclude. What do you think? How does any of that strike you? Gonna have to chew on it for a while? I hope it's good food for thought.
Can you stop sharing? There you go. Well,
I've got a few more things to say.
oh, okay.
We hear a lot about diversity these days, but the smallest minority of all is the individual, and the most important diversity is that of different ideas, which can only be held in individual minds, shaped by a diversity of backgrounds and experiences. It's not your backgrounds and your ethnicity and your DNA that matters, it's what you think of it, what's in your head now. When we interact with others, let us not be like the supernaturalist religious zealots who are only happy if they can get others to agree with them. Let us strive for and be satisfied with understanding and being understood. There is a big difference. Keep this in mind, we can discover that there are lots of ways to interact with civility. Someone says something that rubs you the wrong way or strikes you as wrong, it's fine to say so, but it may even be better to think it over and figure out why it affected you that way, why it rubbed you the wrong way, whether it was intended as you took it, and if it's really wrong, why, and in what way it is wrong, and even what kernel of truth it may contain that makes it appeal to otherwise well-intended people. Remember, learning from other people's mistakes. If what comes out of their mouth is mistaken, think about why it's mistaken and how you can learn from that. Always, always let us not believe too much or too strongly. Enough to know of many things without becoming very attached to any of them. Now, some of you might recall that there was a slide here of Aristotle. I subsequently found that that was kind of a very sloppy translation of what he actually said as far as entertaining ideas without accepting them. Remember that too, that we are minds and bodies. This means we should pay attention to our physical state, be aware of our tone of voice, of any rising feelings of anxiety or feeling threatened. Use those feelings to cause you to think, gosh, what's going on here? We often don't react in the moment the way that we later, when we have the time and opportunity to think about things, would have liked. That happens to me all the time. So sometimes it is best to just take a deep breath and let things go. This is the way of freethinkers. These are our principles. Oh, they spell something. Look at that. Reason, enjoy, appreciate. They spell real. We have spent whole services talking about these various things, but that's as close as it comes to our creed. We ask not just for your moral support and participation in the discussion of the ideas important to us, but also for your financial support. And let us know what else you would like to see us do and be prepared to help us accomplish it. Please visit us on Facebook and Twitter. We're not very active there, but they are outposts of our facts and reason-based outlook and important ways for us to increase and improve the impact of free thought. It is so badly needed. It is your values that are at stake. If you're truly committed to those values, if you believe they are important, remember, as Charles Sanders Peirce, American philosopher, mathematician, pointed out, belief is a disposition to act. Don't act on something because of your belief. How well can you really say that you believe it? We find fault with others who do not act in support of the values that they say they hold. So let us act in support of our values. Together, we can do so much more. We are lucky to have each other in this church. Let us make the most of it by promoting facts and reason, separating doubt. Gandhi put it, be the future you wish to see. Thank you and good morning. And I'm going to introduce something else new. This could be our motto. If we ever have a seal, I think we put it on our seal. Melius facet. That seems a good slogan for people such as us. It is Latin, which means do better. And with that, for those of us in today's video conference, we'll go to discussion and not post whatever comes up on YouTube. So thank you very much. And if you are watching on YouTube, join us next time with our live presentations on Zoom and first Sunday of the month if you're in the area. Thank you.